Wanted to start with going a bit more into you as an individual and why you're interested in the things you do and why you do the things you do as a sort of springboard for everything else. So I wanted to start with a couple of broad questions and you can take your answer in any direction you like. So where do you think your sort of fascination with science came from? Was it something as a child in your sort of personality disposition? Was it your experience in school? And then what is it about science that grips you, maybe on like a philosophical level, and what are your sort of overarching values behind why you do science? And then if you like, you can go into your more specific motivations in the research you do now.
Perfect, yeah, so let's start with the first one, which is like, how did I get involved and interested in science in the first place? Because I don't have a story I feel like most people expect me to say, especially for like doing science on Instagram and stuff now, because when I was growing up, I didn't think of becoming a scientist. I went to like a really small high school up in Minnesota, and it was like a classical school, so it was a public school, but we focused on the classics. So it was like I learned Latin for 7 years, we learned like rhetoric classes, logic classes. There's a lot of emphasis on that kind of stuff, so it's kind of teaching you to be more like a lawyer or a business person. And I'd taken all the science classes that my school offered within the first couple of years, I want to say. They just didn't offer many because, one, it was a really small school, like my graduating class was 27 people, but two, the emphasis was on the classics, I guess. And those classes that I did take in high school that were science classes were really boring, for lack of a better word. It just felt like I was reading out of a textbook, memorizing a bunch of terms. I didn't connect with any of it at all. It seemed dry. I was kind of like, everything's known already. It's a requirement. You've got to tick the box to go on to study cooler things. And then my senior year, my school made us do like a senior thesis. Oh, sorry, my cat's in the background. They made us do like a senior thesis. So typically it was just a lot of writing and you'd research in a project. There's an option which you could do less writing if you volunteered in a lab. So they'd connect you with like a university lab and just shadow for a couple times a week. And that was kind of how I was like, oh, that'd be cool. I'd get out of school for a couple times a morning. I wouldn't have to write as long of a document for my thesis, and I could try something new. So I did that on the whim of just like doing my senior thesis, and I stepped into the lab and I absolutely loved it. I worked for a cancer biology lab, or volunteered at a cancer biology lab for just a couple mornings a week at University of Minnesota, Twin Cities, and it was so cool getting like all the tools, all the technology at your fingertips. And coming from the science classes where I thought everything was very dry, everything was already known, and then getting to be in the lab and sitting down that first day and the professor being like, so we study cancer and we're using Crispr, which we can go into cool technologies later, this cool new technology to gene edit that has just been discovered in the past 10 years, let's say, and we're going to use this in mice to figure out how we can cure cancer. And that was just awesome, getting to see technology that I've read about in textbooks, but actually being applied to real world questions like cancer. So that was kind of the opening of Pandora's box, for lack of a better word. So when I was applying senior year of high school, originally I was applying for business, law-related programs around the country. And so I very quickly, I think it was like September, October time, I was like, oh gosh, I should kind of look for schools that at least have a strong science basis or have cool science research opportunities in case I want to dabble more in that area. So I ended up at the University of Wisconsin-Madison, which you might not be familiar with the state's geography, but Minnesota and Wisconsin are right next to each other. So it's only a 4-hour drive between the cities, which is quite small for the United States. And I went there, and I was so excited about doing research that I found my first research lab before I'd even gotten to UW-Madison, University of Wisconsin-Madison. And things just really took off from there. Every opportunity I could outside of classes, I would try to find my way back into the lab. And I wanted to try all the different, all the different things that were going on in the lab, try as many different labs as I could. And things just really spiraled from there. So that was the answer to the first part of the question. I forgot what the other two parts were.
Well, the second question was more about like, what is it about science itself that grips you on maybe like a philosophical level? And something I just made a point of here is that what I gathered from that story you told was that originally in your schooling, science was like about learning and then being able to regurgitate old truths that people already knew about. and then when you worked in a lab, it was like exciting to have the possibility to discover new unknown truths about how to cure problems we face and about sort of the world. So give us a little more insight into like what is it about the philosophy behind science that fascinates you?
Yeah. So you hit the nail on the head there with what you were saying about that reconceptualization of what science was for me. But I think fundamentally why I think science is so cool is it's about my understanding of science is we're all born at some level scientists. I know that sounds kind of cheesy, but I think the basics, the fundamentals of science is discovering the unknown, right? Trying new things, learning new things, the discovery of knowledge. And if you break that way to the most fundamental, that is what all of us are born doing. We are learning the world around us, we're learning new knowledge, we're learning the unknown. And to be frank, I think at some point, maybe high school, maybe college, it gets beaten out of us a little bit because we're told we need to study so much, we're told we need to do this, that, whatever, to become successful, become real functioning adults in the world. And I think we lose that sense of curiosity or that sense of discovery along the way because we're told, I don't know, maybe that's too kid-like, maybe there's no space for that in whatever job you're doing. But that is what science is. And it's so hard now being in science. I mean, I can see why more people don't want to go into science based on all the stereotypes, there's other issues too that I'm happy to get into about real world, like actually being a scientist. But the fundamentals of what a scientist is, that discovery of knowledge, everyone should be wanting to do that, right? And so we've lost that along the way from schooling to the real world job situations. And I think it's really easy to get back to that. We just need to have that reframing of what science really is.
Yeah, it's like maybe the thing that draws you away from it is being in a lecture theatre, just being told and inputs, whereas it's more the discovery and the more fascination comes from the output of being in the lab and creating something.
Yeah, I mean, it even goes as simple. When I was a kid, we'd all do dumb things, right? And I'd be like, oh, why do people say not to touch the iron when it's plugged in, right? And I touched it. And in itself, I know it sounds silly, but that is a science experiment. Like, you have this hypothesis of like, oh, well, maybe it's not really that hot. And you touch it, you're like, oh, just kidding, that is actually really hot. And there's just baking or cooking. That's another great example of using science in your daily interactions. And we scaled it up into more minute, take getting your flu shot every year. And there's maybe more in the US, but I think around the world we've had issues with vaccines in general and people being the hesitancy because we don't know what's in it. But if you peel it back to like what the science actually is, it's understanding what's in it. And there's that fear of oh, I'm not going to be smart enough to know it, I'm not going to be smart enough to understand what's going on. I think that was kind of taken away from us as we grow up and as we age.
I wanted to ask about this, one of your first experiments, which was, you said you researched cancer with mice. Can you talk a little bit about that?
Yeah, so it was in high school when I did that volunteer opportunity at the Cancer Biology Lab. That was very much, I wasn't actually getting to do many experiments hands-on because, I mean, honestly, they probably didn't trust me, but it was also a big learning opportunity for me. So the lab itself was a cancer biology lab that worked on gene editing with this system called CRISPR-Cas9. And do you guys know what CRISPR-Cas9 is at all? It's fine if you don't. So CRISPR-Cas9 is this revolutionary gene editing thing that came out. One of the women, I believe they got a Nobel Prize for it in the 2010s, Jennifer Doudna, if that rings a bell at all. This group of professors, scientists, figured out that you could live edit people's genomes, or in this case they were doing it in mice to begin with, while they were alive, and accurately be able to replace genomes. And this stuff, I mean, we're starting to talk about real world implications now, which is over 10 years later, but you could take people that have some, say, a type of cancer, and if you know the type of mutation it is, send in CRISPR-Cas9 to be able to go and actually fix that mutation. Now, there's obviously, we're still away from like efficacy, safety of getting this into humans, because there is a lot of potential scary things that could happen if you were live editing someone's human genome. But I'm hoping, next 10, 20 years, I think there's really cool things that come out of that. And so I worked in the lab, or a lab, tons of labs are doing this, that was using that and trying to figure out how to use it in living animals. In this case, I was using it in mice. But in that opportunity, I was mainly just shadowing, so I was learning like what CRISPR-Cas9 was, how the heck to use that in mice, and basic things like asking a research question, what technologies can I use in the lab to answer that? And then just making like lab solutions, things like that for the graduate students. My first time actually doing things in the lab. So when I moved to Wisconsin, I worked for the Wisconsin National Primate Research Center. And so I worked with monkeys, which was really cool. It was also something I learned. I lasted about 6-8 months, I want to say, because I felt really bad for them. I respect a lot of the work that needs to be done with animals, but I learned from working with mice and monkeys, and I also worked with frogs for a bit, that I've too much sympathy, too much empathy for them, and I'd prefer to much rather work on cells that I don't need to mess around with much. But in the Wisconsin National Primate Research Center, I helped with a lot of different scientists, and I helped like collect the blood from the various primates and then run tests on them. The first true like my own research project I got to do, I did an internship in Japan. This is my junior year. So there's a lot of training that goes on, like trying to learn the ropes of things before you're, I guess, entrusted with your own project. So after I'd done a lot of that training, I did an internship in Japan for 6 months for a biotech company out there, where I was helping. They had this bacteria that they could synthesize. They're actually making energy drinks out of it, which to each their own. I guess they were specifically trying to target the American audience. They're like, oh, Japanese people, they don't like energy drinks that much, but Americans like their energy drinks. So I was over there trying to optimize this bacteria to increase more of the protein that they were using to then go on into this energy drink. Yes, so that was a bit of a spiral. I was talking about a lot of different research opportunities, but yeah, let me know if you want me to expand on something or talk more about something else.
Yeah, it's interesting. Like, so for context, I'm a psychology student, right? So whenever we have conversations with different people on the podcast from different fields and stuff, it seems like light bulbs kind of go off in my head where I link something that I've learned about the links to something we've been talking about. So this idea that like humans get so much satisfaction and meaning from diving into things that attract our attention and spark our curiosity. And something very interesting is like the hypothalamus in the brain, that very primal structure that's known for doing the sort of basic necessary biological process to keep us alive, like regulating thirst and hunger and all those like primordial drives. When all those drives are satisfied, the other half of the hypothalamus, which is a lesser known thing, actually coordinates exploratory behavior, right? So when all these basic desires are satisfied and dealt with, our default is to explore the world, to satisfy the curiosities, to try and figure out new ways of doing things. And it kind of, I see that on a macro scale now in the world that we live in as modern humans, that a lot of our basic necessities are satisfied, right? We're lucky enough in this world that a lot of us don't have to think about when our next meal is, or when we're going to get shelter, or how we're going to get access water. And now the way to find meaning in life is not necessarily about survival, but it's more about that other half of the hypothalamus's processes, which is exploring the world and satisfying curiosity. Just thought that as a sort of side point to what we were saying. But let's link that now to the final bit of my first question ramble, which is, what's your current research that you're doing at the moment, and what are your motivations behind that, and what are the curiosities you're trying to satisfy?
Yeah, so I don't actually work in research at the minute. I work in patent law now, but my PhD research project, actually I haven't talked about this in a bit, because I guess I've been in my job now a full year, and ending a PhD, grad school can be a little bit traumatic near the end when you're trying to get out and they don't want you to leave. But my PhD research was in cancer biology, but ended up linking a lot to Alzheimer's as well. So I worked with cells in a petri dish. It was breast cancer cells. And the lab I worked in worked with something called an amaloid, which for amaloid, very simply in basic biology, is a specific type of protein structure. It's called beta amyloid sheets. They're very, very stacked, very close together, a very rigid form. Why it's important in a lot of biology is because amyloids are typically seen in proteins that are bundled up in diseases. So take Alzheimer's, for example. One of the big indications of Alzheimer's disease is seeing beta amyloid, a protein, accumulate extracellularly in clumps of beta amyloid or amyloid-like structures. And most of the time, people think of these associated with disease, Alzheimer's disease, Parkinson's disease, etc. And the goal of a lot of research is how do we get rid of this beta amyloid structure in cells to get them to go to their native structure and then go off and not cause big plaques in the brain. So my lab found this specific amyloid conformation that happens in our cells physiologically, so separate from diseases, but it happens naturally when our cells are introduced to stressors. The stressors I used in the lab were a lot of like heat shock. So I mean, you can think similarly to like when you go into a sauna, for example, you are in essence heat shocking your cells. But another much more common one that happens in our own bodies is a term called acidosis. So when you have low oxygen happens, say if you're a cancer patient, that's a big one. Cancer's rerouted how your blood is flowing through certain parts of your body to the tumor. And it causes the area of the tumor to have low blood supply, so low oxygen that then turns into low pH or acidosis. So this acidotic environment causes stress on your cells, and they see a lot of very interesting things happen. And what my lab specifically studied is under these conditions of stress, we saw cancer cells create these amyloids in the center of the nucleolus of the cells. And what was really interesting is when these amyloids formed in the center of the cells, these cancer cells, the cancer cells would stop dividing, which, if you're familiar at all with cancer research in general, one of the big things of cancer is cancer cells divide like crazy. That's why you get the big things going on, the big tumors, because they are rerouting everything to try to divide cells as fast as possible in your body. So, if you've heard of dormant cancer cells, or say if people go into remission but then they get cancer again, metastasizes, is because there's a group of cells that can go to sleep, go dormant, and then wakes up again. It could be anywhere in the body and reawaken, and those are a lot harder to treat because you might not know where they're going to end up. So my lab, we looked at specifically these cancer cells get these amyloids in the center of their bodies, or in the center of the cells, excuse me. And then the cancer cells stopped dividing. And then when we removed that stress, we were able to remove the stress, which removes these amyloids. The cells started dividing again. So they woke up, they metastasized. And so a lot of my lab's research was focusing on how do these amyloids form in the cancer cells? Why the heck do they even begin in the first place? Because normally we think of amyloids as disease, not as this response to shut down cancer cells. So when I came into the lab, this was 5 years ago now, we just focused a lot on this going in process. But I was curious on how does it go out? How does it, after the stress is over, this amyloid able to disassemble? Because that is very relevant to a lot of diseased amyloids that aren't able to disassemble in our bodies. So are we able to take how our body is able to naturally get rid of these these amyloids that are happening in cancer cells, take that same mechanism and use it for neurodegenerative diseases like Alzheimer's? So my first few years was just looking at all the different proteins that were involved and upregulated in the amyloid disassembly in these cancer cells. And once I'd identified a few specific ones, we do like knockout experiments, so essentially seeing, okay, if we get rid of these specific proteins in our cells, are the cells able to revert to get rid of these amyloids? We found no. So not only are these proteins upregulated when the amyloid is trying to be disassembled, but that the proteins, if we get rid of those specific ones with knockout experiments, the amyloid stays. It's not able to disassemble at all, even when that stress is over. So we took it a step further, like, okay, so we found these proteins that we think are pretty important for how the amyloid disassembles in that cancer cell. Can we apply these to Alzheimer's proteins? Specifically, we used beta amyloid, which is implicated in Alzheimer's disease. And we found, even cooler, that no, that's not the case. That if you get rid of these specific proteins, or you add them into a little cocktail of beta amyloid proteins, you're able to see a disassembly effect, which is super cool, because you're getting to tie in two very different fields. And I think that's one of the coolest. I'm sorry, I'm going on a bit of a ramble here, but for me, and that's kind of what led me to patent law, because I found this merging of different fields, something you think is so different, right? Cancer, neurodegenerative diseases, brain, and then everything else going on. You wouldn't think of them being not only so related, but you can take a discovery from cancer biology and apply it to a field like Alzheimer's and figure out mechanisms of what's going on inside of both different things. And finishing that story, then leading into patent law is, after those 5 years of research, I still miss doing a lot of experiments, but that excitement from seeing interdisciplinary work getting put together, it led me to really loving reading like Science and Nature, big publication science magazines, to see all the different types of research going on in various different fields, and getting to have, like, I guess, my hands in multiple different pots. And so after my PhD, I was like, I want to find something that I combine a lot of that. And one of the, I guess, downsides of research is you are very focused on one specific project, right? Because that is your baby, your expertise. And I was ready to learn about a lot of different science all at once, which in patent law I get to work on a lot of different, so it's clients that are doing, or scientists that are doing a lot of experiments, and then we get to review it, and then figure out how to patent their work, which I really enjoy because I get to see all the data from the cool experiments and appreciate it all, but I'm not having to spend like years troubleshooting it all. Because by the time the scientists come to us with a lot of these inventions, they've spent, maybe a decade doing these experiments, troubleshooting it, trying to figure out what's working, what's not. Which my 5 years now is a drop in the bucket in comparison. So I'm glad to be able to appreciate or reap the rewards of seeing what these cool people are doing. Well, I don't have to be the one necessarily doing that hard work myself anymore.
Yeah, I love the enthusiasm in the way you talk about that story. Like, I can feel like the energy coming off you is so like strong and powerful. It's great to hear. Like, I love it when we get people on and have conversations like this. We can actually feel how invested they are in what they do and what they've done. So that's really nice. And it actually links into a point I wanted to make. This idea that like you can be doing complex science on a cellular level that the average person wouldn't really understand or be interested in, but then it has these very powerful real-world applications to things like Alzheimer's that the average person might have to navigate in a family member or themselves or someone they know or a friend or whatever. And that's an important link, I think, for people to understand. And it links to something I wanted to say to you, which was, could you maybe say, what are the key things, maybe in your experience of research and the things that you're interested in? What are the parts of science and the process of science, or maybe some of the outcomes and results and findings you've learned about, that the average person like me and Jacob or the people listening should have more awareness of? And are there some of those like real world applications that have been most profound to you?
Well, that's a really good question. Let me have a think on that. Because I resonate very deeply with what you were saying about how what you're doing in the lab every day, it might not seem like, oh, I'm working on a bunch of cells, I'm doing this tiny little knockout experiment with some proteins that no one's ever heard of. But the implications that we have for the rest of the world can be really profound. And that's something that, part of the reason I've been really interested in trying to get more people to communicate science as a whole, or just breaking down the barriers between scientists and the rest of the world, is because there shouldn't be that disconnect. I think scientists have built up this ivory tower for themselves, thinking, oh, no one's going to understand what I'm talking about, the specific protein, so I'm going to write up the specific, really niche academic journal that no one can understand. But then if you've got a family member who is diagnosed with lung cancer, and then you've got someone that might go through all the literature about lung cancer to try to figure out what's going on. They're going to have to learn all those specific terms that are going on, those niche journals, etc. But it shouldn't have to be that way. Like, sure, they're complicated terms, but that's just because science makes them a million different acronyms here and there. It is possible to make it understood, and I think it should be part of a scientist or researcher's mission to not only make those discoveries, but make those discoveries accessible to the rest of the world. Because in a lot of cases, our countries, our governments are funding most of that research, right? So why is it that our governments are funding that research, so the people are funding that research, but then the people don't actually know reaping the benefits of that research, right? Sorry, I just went in a really big tangent there. That's something that I'm very passionate about. I think that's like the whole, I guess, guiding principle of my science journey as a whole, is seeing it be out of touch, and it doesn't need to be. But let's go back to the specific science things I think are cool that more people should understand. I think more people should just try reading science journals. And I'm not saying, like, I just talked about all those niche journals that have a million acronyms. I think there's a lot they need to be doing to fix themselves in those regards, but there's some really big ones, like Science Magazine, Nature, journal, and actually those are the two big ones. They write a lot of articles for the general audience as well, so they'll break down terms. They won't be talking about, protein TPA12. They'll actually say what it is and why it's useful for the human. But I think getting more people to feel comfortable just being like, oh, I can read about cancer, or I can read about the latest, I don't know, foot engineering, whatever, I think is getting people away from being scared of touching anything to do with science because they don't think that they are smart enough or equipped enough to do it. I think on the flip side, scientists need to figure out how to write and how to communicate better for the rest of the world. But I do think some specific people are able to do that. If that seemed like too big a step, I also think there's some really cool scientists on social media doing some really explaining science papers to the general audience, which are super cool. Going back to specific science technology, though, a big one that is near and dear to my heart, because that's kind of how I got excited about science in the first place, is this CRISPR-Cas9 gene editing. There's a really cool book. I don't know if you're familiar with. Hold on, I always mess up his name. It's Walter Isaacson or Isaac Walterson. Do you know which one I'm talking about? Thank you. I always switch the two around. Walter Isaacson, a brilliant biographer. He's written a Steve Jobs book. He just wrote the Elon Musk book. But he wrote a book about Jennifer Doudna, so one of the discoverers, the creators of this CRISPR-Cas9 gene editing. Brilliant read if you want to read something that's more, it's general audience related, but it will talk about why CRISPR-Cas9 is as cool as I'm talking about today. But just the implications of something so small that she's researching right in a petri dish, right? You're looking at cells under a microscope. You might be moving it to mice down the road, but you're using basic proteins, basic mechanisms that are in our cell. And then figuring out, oh my gosh, we could inject this into human down the road, let's say. You could really just inject this into humans and change a part of their genome to get rid of a mutation for cancer. A book I was just reading about is one of the big mutations or big genes that gets mutated all the time in cancer patients. It's this gene called P53. And if we're able to fix those mutations in a lot of it's hereditary, right? If you're able to fix that just by giving someone a little shot of something and it fixes that in, then they're not going to die of, millions of type of cancer by the time they're 30. Implications of CRISPR-Cas9 are pretty insane. And that would be a big one. Did I answer your question? I'm sorry, I went really rambling there.
It's all right. I mean, I think maybe a different way to frame my question would be another point I made, which is I read through your blog post about the science reads of 2023, and I enjoyed the way that you'd really broken down and simplified difficult concepts, and your reflections and reviews were pretty coherent and digestible to the average person. So maybe a different way to frame it would be from maybe that list, or maybe things you've read more recently. What are some of the things that stick out to you most? I don't want huge details here, but I know when I read a book that's 300 to 500 pages long, I only really remember a couple of key concepts and theories from it, and those are the things that actually stick with me in my daily life. What are some of those science concepts that have stuck with you from what you've learned that me, Jacob, and the people listening would benefit from hearing about?
Well, I'm going to talk about then this book that I just finished reading. It's the P53 book I just mentioned. So it's about this P53 is this gene that they found is involved in, when it's mutated, is involved in a whole bunch of cancer stuff. And reading that book is really eye-opening, but not for, I guess, talking about those one or two concepts you're talking about. I could tell you about all the different, well, actually, I don't know if I could, because there were a lot of discoveries going on in that book. But one of the underlying takeaways I had from that book is how much of science is down to chance and luck. Because we hear about a lot of science being like, oh, they made this amazing discovery. Going back to this CRISPR-Cas9, oh, they made this amazing discovery. Did it just happen overnight? No. They might have made it and been like, oh, well, that might have been a mistake. And then you repeat it 100 times over. And then after seeing it 100 more times, you're like, well, maybe that's right. And then you try, other systems, other organisms. You have other people do it. Science isn't this thing where it's just like a one and done. And even when you have, this is another really cool concept in the book, cool, but when science is they've got, honestly, very mainstream, because it comes out so many textbooks, there's such a linear Like, people think, okay, because a couple people published about how this is true, this must be true. And so if someone publishes, like, oh, I don't think that's true, they're going to be shat on. Sorry, I probably shouldn't say that. They're going to not be believed. And it takes a lot of people to be able to change the course of, okay, maybe it's not actually A, it's B. And I think that's such a true thing about a lot of science, because we say it's this very, like, okay, it's got to be this, you write a textbook about it. Really good example, something that happened in my lab is, this might be a little niche, but translation typically happens in the cytoplasm of the cell. And so all textbooks, everyone that's written, is translation of everything happens in the cytoplasm. And then a previous grad student in my lab was doing experiments and found that these cells under stress, they start translating in the nucleus, which was like, what? That's crazy, right? So at first she thought she was doing stuff wrong, then repeated it a million times over, right? Then had other people repeating it, which is like, no, I think something's going on. And they published it, and yes, they had, we all believe the research, but you've still got the mainstream people that are saying, oh, no, that translation only happens in the cytoplasm, right? And they're telling us that you're wrong. It's just going to take maybe another decade or two before it makes its way into textbooks. That was a very long-winded way of saying that science is so much more than what we read about it in textbooks, and I think reading, like, science nonfiction, like that P53 book I just mentioned, it highlights, yes, there's cool discoveries along the way, but the underlying that science is not just like a one and done kind of deal, that it takes so many different people collaborating from so many different fields to be able to put this all together. And we need to always be open as well to it changing. Yeah, sorry.
I wanted to ask about kind of like the possibility of curing cancer. So what I'm gathering is, like, there's maybe possibility in stopping the cells from dividing, and rather than maybe some cure that you'll find in the Amazon rainforest. So yeah, I wanted to ask kind of like what is the what do you think is the possibility of curing cancer with science in the future?
Yeah, so actually I'm going back again. I promise I'm not like advertising this P53 book. It's just because I happened to read it a few days ago. They actually ended the book saying, like, quoting a scientist saying, my kids are 21, 22 years old, and I don't think they're ever going to have to deal with cancer in their lifetimes. I'm not that optimistic. I think we're making amazing progress. We're figuring out, there's going to be a lot more of a push into individualized, personalized medicines for cancer therapeutics, because each cancer is so broad. Like, when we talk about cancer is literally just the dividing of cells, and most of that really matters on where specifically it's happening, what mutation is causing those cells to be rapidly dividing. And so being able to sequence everything that's going on in that tumor, and then figuring out, what specific mutation's happening, and then targeting that mutation is how we're going to be able to cure cancer down the line. And I still think CRISPR-Cas9 is going to be an amazing therapeutic for all of that. I'd like to say, I don't want to be that optimistic where I'm like, in our lifetime, no one's going to be dying of cancer anymore. Even if we have all the technology and tools at our fingertips, I think there's enough of a disparity, unfortunately, with how technology gets distributed, that we're going to be dealing with this for a while going forward. But I think we're already getting to the point where a lot of cancer is becoming, from near death sentence to, you've got 5 years, you're going to have to be dealing with terrible treatments and stuff, but then you're going to have a healthy life afterwards. So I'm optimistic enough to say that we are going to be able to treat it. I think a lot of things are already becoming more treatable. Do I think it's going to become an obsolete talking point? I don't think so. I think there's a lot that we still need to do in that front.
But like, can you if you discover the cells before they divide too rapidly, and then we have the technology, in theory, can we like stop the cells from dividing?
Yeah, so in theory, there's right. In theory, a lot of cool, like, we could, if we figure out, like, okay, it's this specific mutation in this person, send in something and fix that mutation. Or, what we've seen a lot of people do is, if you catch it early enough, you just scoop it out, and that's before So when I was talking about a lot of cells, the issue becoming metastasizing is because once cancer cells, say if you've got, let's say breast cancer, once you've got those cells dividing rapidly, you're going to have a subpopulation that's going to go dormant. And so even if you scoop out that breast cancer tissue and you get rid of all of those actively dividing cells, unfortunately there's a very high chance there's going to be a dormant population. And why that dormant cancer cells are so important is because all the drugs that are on the market for cancer cells target actively dividing cells. And that's because the hallmark of cancer cells is the ones that actively divide very fast. I mean, that's why, say, chemotherapy is killing actively dividing cells. That's why you also lose all your hair, because it's not just targeting cancer cells, it's targeting anything that's actively, rapidly dividing. So we've got a lot of things like our hair is rapidly creating new cells to create new hair follicles for us. So if we're able to take technology and take it one step further, not just targeting actively dividing cancer cells, but cancer cells with that specific mutation that those cancer cells are doing. I mean, right what you said, we stop it before it even starts.
Wow.
And that, I mean, long term, that would be the goal, right? You'd get your sequenced genome now as a baby, then maybe get at 18. It might be like a routine doctor's appointment. I'm getting really excited because I think that could be, if we had the resource, the technology, and the funding, we are getting to the day, like back when the human genome was first sequenced in early 2000, that cost, billions of dollars. It was a huge, super expensive project, right? Over decades. And now we're getting to the point where I can spend $70 in the lab and send something off to be sequenced in a day. We're able to make things so much more cost effective, where I would love to say that one day we'd be able to get to that. I think it goes more into the faith of humanity being able to distribute that technology effectively.
No, but that's amazing, and that's really like hopeful. I wanted to pivot to another book that you've read that I just found intrigue in the title. So you did a post about this book, An Immense World, and the animals, about like these hidden realms that they maybe live in. Can you talk a little bit about what you learned from that book?
Yes, sorry, my laptop's back to down, just making sure it's plugged in. Yeah. There we go. Immense World. That was a few months ago. See if I remember how much I remember of this book. So the guy who wrote that is a journalist, but he's a science journalist. I think that's where the coolest books come from, because you've got people who aren't trained as scientists, but go and like speak with scientists, and they're able to extract, essentially what is cool, because scientists could talk. I mean, you probably just heard me. I was probably talking about a lot of things where you guys were like, I don't know if that really matters, but the fundamentals of like, okay, we could maybe cure cancer. That's the cool takeaway. And so I think people that aren't trained necessarily as scientists, but then are able to go into the world and understand what those scientists are talking about and translate it for the rest of the world, are the real unsung heroes, because they're able to do things like Immense World, where they're able to take observations of the world around us from scientists all over the globe studying all different types of animals and compile it into a book that you don't want to put down. So Immense World was a lot about talking about different animals, different species, and how they all see the world very differently. Because even what I just said, see the world, we are very much as humans vision conscious. Like, we focus on how we describe the world, how we interact with the world based on our vision. And I never really thought about that until I read that book, how a lot of other animals, vision isn't their strongest suit. They might be focused way more on hearing or smelling or feeling. And how we as a species have evolved so much to be dependent on our vision. And I mean, think about our language. I was just talking about seeing the world around us. That was based on us talking about vision being our primary thing. If you were another animal and say they developed being able to speak, etc., they might talk about hearing the world around them instead, or feeling the world around them. So I think that was one of the coolest takeaways, is how differently we, like, you even expect, say, certain animals to work this way, because they're like, oh, didn't they see me? And it's like, well, maybe they didn't see you because they don't have really good vision. Stuff like that. Really cool book, though. His name, Ed Yong. He is a phenomenal science journalist. He does write for newspapers as well, but he's written a few other books that are all equally, like, you read it in a weekend and you can't believe that it's nonfiction.
Yeah, it's interesting, that kind of thing, because it makes you realize that the world is the physical place that we experience it as is not necessarily what the world is. It's sort of just a small filter of the total complexity that's actually there. And say the world, according to a mole that's basically blind and navigates mainly through their olfactory processes, is a completely different world, and yet it's still the same physical world. And obviously that's something that fascinates me, in the idea that the world we live in physically is sometimes quite different from the world we live in psychologically, and how can we sort of deal with that disparity. So very interesting. Do you find that things like that sort of mold, like your investigations into science, mold your worldview and the way you think about things? I mean, you've talked a lot about the genetic processes behind cancer cures and things like that, and I'm thinking more broadly from all these books that you've read. Are there things where you're navigating the world and, like, you might see an animal and then you'll think about a theory from a book you read about their sense perception, and like how has your scientific investigation affected your like mundane daily life? Are there any ways that stick out to you when I mention things like that?
I think for my science background, the biggest thing that I'd say it's affected me in is realizing how much of the world just truly is unknown. I know that sounds very simple, but say when I was in high school, I thought, science was all boring, already known. Why is the sky blue? Well, it's because of how the light diffracts and on the different particles. But now getting to experience, science research and seeing how much we really don't know, and say that book, going back to Immense World, and seeing like, okay, we know all these animals exist, but we don't actually know a lot of the details of, how they might see, how they might interact with each other. There's so much we don't know, and I think having that appreciation for how little we actually know makes the world much more of an exciting place. And this goes into something you were talking about earlier. Don't
worry,
we lost him.
His connection's just a bit dodgy. He'll be back though. You can keep going.
Okay. Sorry, I lost my train of thought.
Well, actually, something.
It was what?
Sorry, something
Yeah.
I've just wrote
No,
down then, from what you're saying. Have you heard of a phenomenon known as the Dunning-Kruger effect?
No.
It's basically there's like layman's statement behind that is it's why smart people think they're dumb, right? Because basically it says it uses like this metaphor that knowledge is like a circle, right? And you fill in the circle with what you know, right? And the circumference of this circle kind of represents everything you realize you don't know. And the Dunning-Kruger effect basically says that as your knowledge grows and grows and that circle expands and expands and expands, so does the circumference in a potentially disproportionate manner. So the more knowledge you gain, the more you realize there's so much unknown on the surface of that knowledge that you just haven't quite reached yet. Which is kind of on the lines of what you're saying.
I have said, so I didn't know there was actually a name for this. That's brilliant. You're going to have to email me that specific name afterwards, because I have said that for so long. Like, the longer I've been in science, the less I feel like I know. And I had no clue that was actually like an observed effect that people have. But it completely spot on, yeah.
Yeah, interesting. I'll just see, Jacob, can you hear us? Are you alright, mate?
Yeah, sorry. When it comes to the end of a call, like, my phone camera just decides to switch off, so I have to quickly switch it to my Mac, and I didn't get all of that, but
that's cool. Jake, do you have any specific points before I go into the usual last question?
I want to ask about one more book, which is Playing with Reality by Kelly Clark. Can you talk to me about what you sort of took away from that?
Yeah, so that book was phenomenal. That was actually gifted to me, which I felt like that was a real like full circle moment, that a scientist actually wanted to send me her book. But really cool book. So the idea of that was playing with with game theory, and the only thing I'd say is I was hoping it would get more into the future of of AI and how we can use that in the world around us. But it was a lot more talking about game theory and the society we've built around using game theory as a model, but also the shortcomings of game theory.
Well, what did you mean by game theory? Sorry.
Yeah, so game theory is hold on. I want to make sure I'm explaining this right before I sound like a complete theory. Is it going to work? Come on, Wi-Fi. I guess it hotspot might not work. Okay, good. I'm going to keep it with what the definition on Wikipedia is telling me, which is the mathematical models of strategic interactions. And so in theory, it's like trying to use games to understand the world around us and teach ourselves. And I'm trying to think, like, say if we study... let's talk about when we play video games all the time, right? Like, those are... using game theory to try to understand the world around us to a certain extent. And so an example that always stuck with me in that book was she talked about how people try to use game theory to understand healthcare. Because, I'm living in America, you're living in Britain, very different healthcare structures, right? And I'd say that neither of our countries have figured it out. But I'd also say I don't know a country that's figured it out. So people thought, oh, it'd be a great way to use, like, AI, use a game system to play out a version of various different healthcare structures, right? So instead of doing like a real world, so it's like a simulation essentially to fast track what our knowledge would be, instead of doing it, like, how do I explain this right? Are you following what I'm saying? I don't know if
so
I'm doing
is
a
it kind of
great
like
job on this.
life is like a game, and like the healthcare comes in because that's the ending of the game?
So it's how using games to understand the world around us. So for example, this healthcare example, what they tried to do was build a simulation of the world in a game structure, and then input specific variables of the healthcare model, and then see how the world would respond, or how that specific country would respond to it. And interestingly, healthcare is so complex, that's where game theory really starts to fall apart, is because game theory relies on specific rules, specific metrics, specific structures, because that is games, right? Games need rules. But they found that more complicated things in our world, like healthcare, you can't do that, because there's always so many exceptions you need to build in, that anytime you try to put a finite rule on things, it starts to crack at the edges. That was one of the really cool takeaways that I had from playing with reality, is that there's only so much that game theory as a concept can do. And game theory is used a ton in economics as well, so like modeling our world economies and our country economies. And so essentially she's telling people, you need to wake up a little bit. Sure, these do have valuable insights, but there's a lot more that goes on to the real world than you putting specific numbers and equations to model it all.
So just so I'm following, is game theory kind of like you use theoretical models based on rules and like kind of like systems that work with the inputs and outputs and data and all that to try and understand how the world works, and then apply things that you want to figure out to those rules and regulations to see if it works? Am I sort of following?
Yes. Yeah, so actually I think a really good example is, have you guys heard of that prisoners experiment that was done in California ages ago, where they took volunteers that were either prisoners or guards,
Stanford prison
and then they
experiment.
that
Yeah.
So that in itself is a game theory experiment. It is studies, like watching what people do in a specific scenario and then applying that to the bigger picture. And so the problems, and that's what the book's trying to get into, is the specific scenario can never fully encompass the big picture of the world. But they do give us valuable insights, like that Stanford prison experiment, seeing that people can... that people might do things just because what they see other people treating them as. But with the caveat of that might not apply in the real world.
Yeah. The map is never truly reflective of the territory. We can try and we can try and understand the world, whatever that phrase really means, but we're never truly going to create a complete picture of what's really going on here. And I kind of like that. That's where the sort of spiritual, philosophical side of me comes in and goes, I like the fact that the question of what the hell's going on can never really truly be answered. We're getting somewhere and the trend seems good, but that pursuit will always be there.
that's why, so at the end of the book talks about AI. So AI is something I guess I was talking about CRISPR before. The future of AI, I mean, in every sort of area is revolutionary. I mean, this year I think is the first year we've really seen it taking off. But the AI mixed with science is going to be, I mean, we're already seeing implications of it. Like this year, one of the Nobel Prize winners for protein structure was someone, I think it was a decade ago, that figured out they could use AI to model protein structures that haven't been figured out before. And protein structures are super important because if a protein folds in a specific way, it might be able to work as a drug versus it won't be able to bind to whatever target it needs in the human body. So before, it'd take decades of work just to figure out one protein structure, and there's millions out there. So they were able to train an AI model to figure out with 99.99% accuracy how to model these proteins without doing any experiments in the lab. And sorry, that was a bit of a tangent. I think AI is super cool, but the book for Playing with Reality goes into how AI could be the next way of, instead of game theory being one specific simulation, AI, you can train it to look at a whole bunch of different simulations. And then it goes into that question, right? Can AI ever be trained to be identical to real life? Like where we talk about, can AI ever like truly match the human intellect? It doesn't answer that. It doesn't really go into it that much. But I think those are the questions that I think are really, really interesting.
Yeah.
You can keep going with the finisher. I'm just getting kicked out the room, so I'll let you go ask the last question.
Yeah. So we usually end our guest episodes in the same way, which is through giving the person that's come on an opportunity to say anything they'd like to me and Jacob or the world, because this will be immortalized via Spotify and the clips we put online and all this stuff. So is there anything, if I just give you the microphone, that you want to say to the world? It can be to do with science and your story, or just something you feel people need to know.
Give me 1 second, sorry.
That's fine, no rush.
I think the message that I would like, because I wish I'd known this when I was younger as well, is that science is fun. And I know that sounds, again, very, very big picture, but I think there's been this misconception for so long that it's scientists versus everyone else, and that yes, we need scientists to do this, but then there's that disconnect between everything else that goes on in the world. And I think we saw that really poignantly with the COVID-19 pandemic. This distrust towards science. And I guess my simple is that there doesn't need to be that, because science is, in essence, that figuring out that human knowledge, and we should be encouraging everyone to want to be scientists in what they do day to day. So I encourage everyone to pick up a book about science, to actually explore what interests them, and not think of shying away from science because, oh, they're going to have some complex terms I don't understand. And instead go into it being like, I don't know what's going on, but I'm excited to learn. I'm excited to figure it out. And so I think it's that mind shift that we need to have with the world, with our society, to get more people into STEM, because I do think there's so many different cool perspectives that can come from having different types of people in STEM. And for so long historically, it has weeded out a lot of those diverse perspectives through discrimination, through a lot of different avenues, where it forces a very specific select type of people with a same specific type of brain to succeed in academia, to become professors. And we're seeing recently with the different, it goes back to like interdisciplinary nature and how getting different disciplines together can really crack open the lid on something. That's the same reason why having different perspectives look at issues is so valuable to being able to figure out new questions and then being able to answer them in new, exciting ways. Yes.
Thank you, Chloe. Where should people find you if they want to know more about you?
Oh, that's a great question. So probably my Instagram is chloe.the.scientist, Chloe spelled Chloe, not with the K. And then I have a website that's just chloecirk.com.
Cool. Thank you for your time, and thanks everyone for listening.
Thank you.